This is Garis, Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 512, part 2, entitled The Masculist Negro Slavery, Man-Slavery Argument. Continuing straight on. This is the situation we find ourselves in today, where the divorce courts have become the battleground between the sexes. From the male perspective, modern divorce is so toxic for men that in many countries now 2/3 of young men refuse to marry and reject paternity, spending their money on themselves, living the MGTOW lifestyle, men going their own way, and thus crashing the birth rate, but in reality are merely refusing to face a 1 chance in 4 of being financially massacred in a feminist-controlled divorce court. Thus grew the Masculist movement, which aims to do for men what feminism did for women, that is, to liberate men from decades of man-slavery to a woman, working for her for decades. Masculists are modern-day abolitionists. Masculists have a very powerful argument against women that goes as follows. Even the most bigoted of feminazis cannot rebut the inexorable logic of the following masculist argument, that is, quote, women were given science-based medicine by men and now have a life expectancy of 85 years. Men gave women the pill and household gadgets and higher education. So even those women who stay at home looking after small kids still have a career window of half a century. So the masculists are pointing the finger at women, saying, now that you women can work, you must work, since anything else is man's slavery. And to masculists, man's slavery is slavery, and hence hated and a war issue. You women will get off your fat parasitic arses and FIP up, that is, become FIPs, equals financially independent persons. Or you will be ultimately you will be killed as hated manslavers, living off the labour and money of a man, a major and hated gender crime by women against men. End quote. For the above reason, masculists put enormous moral pressure on women to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up, or be severely punished by men by not getting one. This masculist message that women have to become FIPs or be rejected socially and sexually is really penetrating the young male mind. For example, I read in the UK that young men now care more about the level of fitness of a potential girlfriend than they do about her looks, which is a strong statement. They are looking at these young women with a very cold eye, asking themselves, quote, is this woman a fluffy? Does she expect to live off my money and labour for decades? Will she then drag me off to the hated, fluffy, feminist-controlled divorce court system and financially crucify me, ripping my kids away from me? Fuck that. If she's a fluffy, she can rot on the shelf. I won't go near a fluffy, manslaving parasite. They deserve to be exterminated, since manslavery is a hated, decades-lasting gender crime against men that is no longer tolerated by masculisted men who see fluffies in the 21st century the way that abolitionists in the northern states of the US saw southern Negro slavers in the 1800s. Masculists see clearly that women now can work, so must work, and work as well as men do. That is, women need to get off their fat, lazy, parasitic asses and FIP up, as well as men do, by bothering to get a career-competent education and not settle for fluffy crap majors in high school and college that will make them fluffy crappers who grew up to be fluffies as adults, who then expect to be manslavers for decades of men's lives, manslaving a man, manipulating him with sex so that he works for her, paying for the middle-class house she wants to raise her kids in and expects him to pay for it all. Masculists are out to change all this by putting enormous moral pressure on women to fip up. Young male classmates are increasingly having their masculist consciousnesses raised by being taught masculist ideas by the masculists on the internet, which is the main channel for masculist information. Millions of young men's minds are being influenced by masculist ideas, and it is changing the way that they see the world, no longer accepting the idea that it is their role in life to be a manslave to a fluffy, manslaving parasite. Instead, they put moral pressure on their female classmates to fip up, to study career competent majors, to not be fluffy crappers, to study STEM fields and the professions at college so that they can be effective fips as adults, pulling their own financial weight and not expecting fluffy style to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life. A young woman who gets the reputation in her social circle of being a fluffy will be given the kiss of death by her male classmates and male work colleagues, who will see her as vermin, morally inferior, contemptible, and worthy of being both socially and sexually excluded from male attention. These young men will make the lives of these young fluffy crappers utterly miserable, resulting in millions of young women pouring into STEM and other career competent fields. Fluffies who have a life plan in the back of their heads that they only have to wiggle their twat at some man in order to get him to work for her. So fluffies can afford to ignore the advice of the feminists, who use the carrot approach when persuading young women to study STEM and the professions to become fips. But fluffies can afford to ignore the advice of them, or cannot afford to ignore the advice of the masculists, who use the stick approach when persuading young women to fip up. Due to the massive spread of masculist and MGTOW ideas, the supply of traditional manslavable men is drying up, as millions of young men around the world are profoundly influenced by masculist and MGTOW ideas, who don't want to end up as cannon fodder in a hated, fluffy feminist divorce court, and have his life ruined by these hated, fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges who know nothing about masculist ideas, who think that gender oppression is a one-way street, which is what the feminists have been preaching for the past 6 decades. These young women will have masculist slogans ringing in their ears, such as "No calculus, no baby," "Be fip or be manless," "Fluffies rot on the shelf," "Now women can work, they must work," and the like. Masculist moral pressure on women in the coming decade, due to the spread of masculist and MGTOW ideas, will be so pervasive that no young woman can afford to ignore it through fear of being cast out if she does. In the distant past, for a woman to be cast out of the tribe was to be condemned to death. So women have it in their DNA, a powerful fear of rejection. But if they don't fib up, if they don't reject being fluffy manslavers, then that is what will happen to them. They will be rejected by young men who will spit at them for being immoral, hateable manslavers who deserve to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and cast out of society. Masculists thus see manslavery in much the same terms as abolitionists saw Negro slavery nearly 2 centuries ago and fight against it. Abolitionists saw Negro slavery as a moral abomination and went to war to stop it. Masculists see manslavery as a moral abomination and will go to war to stop it if necessary, with a sex war, putting powerful moral pressure on women to fip up or be left to rot on the shelf. To have your masculist consciousness raised means essentially that you see fluffydom as manslavery and manslavery as slavery, and hence something to be hated and a war issue. Masculists are at war against the fluffies and treat them as vermin, that is, to wipe them out by totally ignoring them, forcing them to fip up or they rot on the shelf. Masculists have an even greater hatred against the fluffy feminists who currently control the divorce courts, because it is bad enough that they are fluffies and hence decades-lasting manslavers, but they're also hypocrites and genociders because they want equal rights with men in the parliaments but reject equal obligations with men to share equally the burden of earning the living, so behave as feminists in the parliaments but as fluffies in the divorce courts, making themselves hated by the masculists for their blatant hypocrisy. They are also indirect genociders because they have made divorce so toxic for men that they have made marriage and paternity toxic for men. So now 2/3 of young men in many countries reject marriage and paternity, choosing to live the MGTOW lifestyle, thus crashing the birth rate, but are merely reacting to the toxicity of the divorce courts. So, indirectly, these hated fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges are genociders who have to be stopped with bullets if necessary in a sex war. These masculinist ideas are really getting out there now, influencing the minds of millions and later billions of people, so that huge numbers of men refuse to be manslaves and who then start moving politically to change the gender laws, making them men fair. For example, the divorce courts need to throw out alimony to make custody of the kids joint by default. Masculist gender politicians need to make new men-fair gender laws to block paternity fraud, for example, by passing the OPTAB, that's OPTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births, and to legislate the paternity rejection right, so that men have the same right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, so that if the mother continues with it, the full costs of the kid fall on her, which if she is a FIP, she can afford. GECs, that's GECs, Gender Equality Committees, that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, need to be established so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally, which is far from being the case today, in which most people of both sexes equate gender equality with women's equality. Masculists wince at this sexist hypocrisy, knowing that women in fact oppress men worse, since many of women's gender crimes against men last decades, the worst being women's decades-lasting man-slavery. Masculists see man-slavery as such a major and horrific gender crime against men that they are prepared to go to war to stop it. It doesn't have to be a shooting war. Merely totally ignoring fluffies will have the same effect. Already, millions of young women are now panicking because they are finding with boyfriend after boyfriend that these young men refuse to give them their sperm, arguing that they utterly reject facing a 1 chance in 4 of being financially massacred in the hated, fluffy, feminist-controlled divorce court system. Masculists tell these young women to hate the fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges as much as men do, since it is these women who are the root cause of these young women's babyless